Rachel, big idea here. Make sure you've got this. Multicellularity does not evolve just once, but it evolves numerous times independently within different lineages of the protists. So, in separate instances of convergent evolution, multicellularity evolves, giving rise to the brown algae that you know as kelp, the red and the green algae, which you likely call seaweed. One type of multicellular green algae, the Charophytes, is what gives rise to the multicellular kingdom Plantae. Multicellularity evolves numerous times independently within the kingdom fungi, and of course, in the lineage that we now call the kingdom Animalia. All animals are multicellular, and that multicellularity started with protists like modern day Choanoflagellates working together. Have you ever been to Monterey Bay or maybe the Catalina Islands in Southern California? If you haven't, you gotta go and snorkel around. The water's cold, but the views are spectacular. There are underwater kelp forests. Really important, kelp, which is a type of brown algae, is a multicellular protist. Good true false question. We also see multicellularity evolve in the lineage that we commonly refer to as the red algae, and in this lineage of green algae known as the chlorophytes. These are two independent, separate instances. So these are the many, many seaweeds. This one is pretty common. I often refer to it as sea lettuce. So what's so amazing is that there is this very clear progression from unicellular to colony-like organisms all the way to multicellularity, all within the green algae. So on the top left, this is Chlamydomonas. So they're going to spend their entire lives operating as individual single cells of photosynthetic algae. However, as we move over to Gonium and Pandorea, we're going to get these intermediate stages where they spend part of their life cycles as unicellular individuals, and then the other part of their life cycle bound together with other individuals working as a colony. However, by the time we get over here to the bottom right, we arrive at a really cool multicellular green algae known as Volvox. So this is true multicellularity, and it's the descendants of algae like Chlamydomonas that are now permanently bonded into a multicellular organism, albeit a simple multicellular organism. So you would think to go from a unicellular algae like Chlamydomonas all the way to this multicellular green algae like Volvox, it would require radical and widespread genetic change. But what is totally wild to my mind is there are only a few novel genes that are going to distinguish unicellular Chlamydomonas and multicellular Volvox. As we see again and again across evolutionary history, existing genes are simply repurposed, and those repurposed genes give rise to new emergent properties like multicellularity. Multicellularity is going to again evolve independently in another separate lineage of green algae known as the Charophytes. And we're going to be coming back to the Charophytes, specifically a really important charophyte known as Zygnema, in our next learning activity as we talk about the colonization of land by plants. but Zygnema is the closest extant green algae, both genetically and morphologically, to all of the land plants, from little green mosses growing on rocks to the giant sequoia, meaning every member of the kingdom Plantae share a common ancestor with something that probably looked very much like the extant Zygnema. As we'll discuss in our next learning activity, all plants are multicellular. It's one of the distinguishing characteristics of the kingdom Plantae. And they're all descended from a multicellular green algae in the Charophyte lineage, which colonizes land and eventually radiates into the kingdom Plantae, multicellular photosynthetic eukaryotes. The kingdom fungi, eukaryotic heterotrophs that do not do photosynthesis but are going to acquire their food through absorption, they're going to evolve multicellularity independently at least 3 separate times within this kingdom throughout their evolutionary history. And as we'll see in the slime molds, this lineage below, there's also fungus-like creatures that kind of blur the lines between uni and multicellularity. And finally, we get to maybe many of y'all's favorite kingdom, the kingdom Animalia. So unlike the fungi, in which some of them, like the yeasts, are unicellular, all animals are multicellular. From the tiniest little micro animals like the tardigrades to the behemoth blue whales. See this lineage of protists right here? The Choanoflagellates. They're very important to our story. So we're going to discuss these amazing little protists more extensively in learning activity 8.2. But in short, the Choanoflagellates act like free-living unicellular protists, all doing their thing with their little flagella, swimming around looking for food. However, at some point in their life cycle, they will form colonies that work together and beat their flagella collectively to create currents and collect food. There's several hypotheses for why the signaling starts, which triggers the colonial behavior, but there's nothing definitive yet. It may be in response to food shortage, or it may be in response to really dense patches of food. But regardless, when signaling occurs, then the adhering together begins. The choanoflagellates are considered to be the closest extant or living relatives of the simplest animals, the sponges. Members of the phylum Porifera, the sponges are the first true multicellular animals. So sponges lack tissues. All of their cells are the same. All of their cells are unspecialized. Sponges evolved some 660 to 700 million years ago. However, molecular clock data is pushing that back even farther. Regardless, they represent the basal taxon, the outlier relative to all the other animal lineages. So sponges are composed of collar cells called choanocytes, which essentially resemble choanoflagellates that have now become permanently bonded by a protein matrix into a single multicellular filter feeding animal. But more on the rise of animal diversity and learning activity 8.2.